It's like if somebody had a lost Da Vinci or something, they don't want to let it go. I mean, there were literally cases where the collector had to die before we could get our hands on these recordings.
Hi, and welcome to And If Love Remains. I am your host, Mike Levitt, and we are here today again with Dr. Elias Axel Pedersen, and we have a special guest, Mark Ainley. Mark is an internationally recognized authority on the art of piano playing and historical piano recordings. He's best known for his work in discovering unpublished recordings of the legendary pianist. Is it Dinu?
Yes, Dinu. That's right.
Dinu
Lipatti.
Lipatti. There you go. See, my Italian's getting better every day, which led to world premiere award-winning releases of over 3 hours of previously lost performances by the revered artist. He has since his late teens authored CD liner notes and magazine articles on a range of pianists of different sensibilities, and he has lectured across North America, Europe, and Asia. His popular Facebook page, The Piano Files with Mark Ainley, is a hub for professionals and amateurs alike to explore great piano playing via recording history. Ainley explores how historical recordings can help today's performers and listeners better appreciate music written decades or centuries ago. In addition to presenting examples of piano playing that can be radically different than today's norms. And I'm extremely excited about this topic. I'm so pumped to talk to Mark. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, it's wonderful. And I really want to talk to you about the subject matter, but I'm very interested. How does somebody get into historical piano recordings? I mean, that's kind of that's a niche.
Very niche, and it's like many, I think, important things in life. It happened quite unexpectedly and synchronistically. When I was about 15, I was learning Beethoven's 32 variations and was just looking around for recordings of the piece and couldn't find one very easily, and went to the big record store downtown back in the days when we had record stores.
Yeah.
And it was in Montreal where I grew up, and so I went to A&A and I went flipping through, and all I could find was this European import record that was like $10 or $11, which in 1985 was like a small fortune. And so I thought, well, it's a European import, it's real fancy and everything, it's got to be good. So I shelled out, and keeping in mind that's probably like $30 or $40 today, right? And I shelled out, and I went home, listened to it, and I was like, well, this is a bit bland, actually. I was really disappointed in what I was hearing. And so I took the record to my piano teacher, and she agreed. But so that raised one question, which is, how are artists getting to record and they're actually not necessarily great? And what was it that makes a performance great? Like, why I was still pretty basic at that time, but I was like, oh, I can recognize that this isn't quite on.
Right.
So that was one thing. But then when I was putting the record away, my teacher made this offhand comment that just is what opened up this whole world. She said, wow, look how thin that record is. You should see the old records I've got in my closet. And so we go to her entry closet, and she starts handing me box after box of these old 78s. And, I'd had in my mind the image of, big old scratchy records and, gramophone horns and all of that.
Right.
And she starts handing me one after the other. She's like, I used to have an old record of Horowitz playing this, but let's see if we can find it. And then she hands me this one album with these beautiful hands on the cover. And she's like, oh, look, Rachmaninoff plays Rachmaninoff. And I was like, wait, what? Like, composers recorded?
Yeah.
And for me, it was just kind of like, everything classical, all the composers, it's like way in the past. I had no idea when Rachmaninoff lived, and I actually didn't know his music, at the age of 15. But what this woke up for me is like, wait, when did recording start? I had no idea if any of those old sort of scratchy wind-up cylinders had been done by Mozart or Beethoven or Chopin, I had no clue.
Right.
on any of this. And then I thought, well, this is, first of all, composer playing their own music. Like, what? This is kind of amazing to consider. And I was like, here I was listening to this piece by Beethoven played by somebody. I was like, not that great, right? And what just got me thinking, what's a good performance? And you'd expect a composer playing their own music, that would be, quote unquote, authentic. So like many old turntables, the one that I had at home played 78s, right? The good old turntables used to do 33, 45, right, and 78. So I asked her if I could borrow the records, and I did. And I went home and was really surprised after, the first record spinning fast. I was like, wait, it just cut off in the middle of the music. I'm like, well, yeah, because
right. Turn it over.
78, it's only, 4.5 minutes per side, which means longer pieces had to be cut up into sections.
Right.
So I just, did the pause on the cassette and, hit it at the right time and sort of created this seamless flow, sort of my early DJ technique sort of training there. And I was just listening, and I decided I just wanted to read about this, because in the days before the internet, there was these things called books that you would get at these buildings called libraries, and where they also had records where you could go and sit in a room and listen in real time, because that's how you had to do it with no internet. And if you didn't own the recording or want to spend that much on it, so I just, I got Harold Schonberg's book, The Great Pianists, which became my Bible, and he talked about a lot of old recordings and pianists who recorded, as well as what to listen for. And so, I wrote down all of these names of these great pianists and would go to secondhand record stores and flip through these records. And I developed a really good finger technique for flipping through record stacks, much better than I ever was at the piano. But I was like really good at like flipping through very quickly and spotting good recordings. So I started building up my record collection that way. And I was comparing what I was hearing to what he was saying and training my ears to recognize the differences in performances. And that's basically how this whole thing started.
Wow. That's awesome. I love hearing, like, going through some of the history of these people and just all these memories for myself from learning things that are coming up too. So, and I think we're of a similar age too. So I remember having to borrow CDs, but I remember some early records and tapes, cassettes, trying to record so you could listen to it on your own, on your Walkman. And it's good memories.
Waiting in the libraries for the recorder so you could listen to the right. I remember those.
Totally. And then, trying to record everything onto one cassette, and then it runs out of time.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like people, the kids nowadays will have no idea, where they're shaking our fist at the sky.
Yeah. The best way to rewind a tape, you put a pencil in it and
I know, exactly. We know all those tricks. Yeah.
Yeah. Or a pen.
Oh,
so anyway, Mike, go ahead.
Oh no! So how did that lead into? I mean, obviously, you that gained your passion. That really drove, where you are today. But how did that turn into what you're doing? And what kind of was the next part of that process for you?
Well, I just started, listening to as much as possible. And, eventually back in the days where, there's pen pals and one person introduces you to another, there was this kind of underground network that I got connected to. And I eventually got connected to Gregor Benko, who is founder of the International Piano Archives, who's the one who, he himself back, in his 20s, got obsessed with Joseph Hoffman, who made no commercial recordings after 1923 or 24, but tracked down these live recordings from the 30s and 40s and so on, and was issuing them. And he was an incredible support in helping me in my research, which then turned into wanting to find lost recordings of Dinu Lipatti, who was this great pianist who was revered by all of the musical elite of his time, but who died at the age of 33 of Hodgkin's disease, and never left Europe, but his records were international bestsellers, just the 3 hours or so that he had recorded. And after his death, in like the period of 20 or 30 years, another 3 hours had turned up. Fast forward to now, I've added about 3.5 hours as well to his discography. So
that's incredible.
Back in the day, I mean, and it is like a spy story. Like, I mean, we could do multiple episodes on, just that whole story. The way it's like if somebody had a lost Da Vinci or something, they don't want to let it go. I mean, there were literally cases where the collector had to die before we could get our hands on these recordings because they wouldn't release them. It was just,
It's
it's
amazing.
astounding. So I started exploring, Lipatti was a major focus, but I was really interested in a lot of these artists because it seemed like there was something different going on. There was a different sensibility to how people played.
Right.
And I became aware, going back to Rachmaninoff, listening to his concerto in 1929 that he recorded, and listening to recordings made in the 1950s, which is only, 20-ish years later. And the playing was already different. So I was thinking, okay, so if playing has changed that much in a quarter century, then how far off the mark might we be with music that's 100 or 200 years old?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, it
how
leads
much
into
is the game of broken telephone, in a sense, right? Where generation by generation, all of a sudden, we're getting further and further off the mark.
This leads a lot to, I think, the historical movement or historical performance practice movement, which has really come into its strength in the last 30 years or so. And that's going back to Baroque and classical eras. But there's a lot to be said for it. There are things I might disagree with as well, and maybe we'll touch on that. I just wanted to make a brief thing. You mentioned IPAM, International Piano Archives, and I actually have a connection with that, but with the predecessor. No, not predecessor. The
successor
to Benko, which is Donald Manildi, who's now been there. And I know you have a lot of contact with him. And I think that's also one of the ways I first heard about your name was I was researching. I did my master's there. I was researching pieces and listening to different recordings. And I would go there probably on a weekly basis, and he'd show me a recording I'd never heard of before. And also they got a lot of collections. I remember some of the stories too. He would say, "Oh, I'm going up to New York to talk with a collector and hopefully buy one of these records for $1,000 or something." And then he'd get it. Or I think they had a lock of Liszt's hair, and I never saw it, but I heard about it. And actually, you mentioned Schonberg too, or Harold C. Schonberg. When he died, his CD collection was donated to IPAM, and all the duplicates were available for sale. So I have about 200 of his old CD collection.
How awesome!
Yeah,
I mean, go ahead, continue.
No, I was just going to say, I think I got into some of the great pianists like Lipatti, like Courtauld, like Hoffman, which I'd known about and I'd read about, and somebody like Courtauld, where I always said, "Oh well, he misses notes, so he's not good." That's kind of what I knew about him. And then I would listen, like, well, this is phenomenal musicianship, and like the Art of Piano video I remember watching, and Shandor, I remember talking about Rachmaninoff. He said, fortunately, Rachmaninoff recorded all his piano concerti. Unfortunately, people don't listen to them today.
It's such a fabulous quote. And his voice as he says it. And this is something that's really astounding. I think he's pointing to this fact that there is this incredible resource that's there. And, not everybody could, you're so lucky. I've never actually been to Maryland to be able to go to see the archives in person. I've only met Manildi once when we spoke at the same conference, but, we're in regular email contact. But we have the internet now. It's just the click of a button to be able to access this stuff that I had to go, digging around these musty old secondhand record stores in Montreal when I was a teen, and, shelling out, fortunately, sometimes just a few bucks for some of these recordings because they had no idea what the value was. And artistically, the value is always way beyond dollar value, right? So that's one of the challenges. But I too, when I first heard Courtauld, I bought the Chopin Etudes, and I didn't know them. It was the first set that I ever heard. I was like, wow, there's quite a few clinkers in here. And that's what you hear when you're listening to that one thing, because our ears have gotten sanitized by, incredibly clean recordings thanks to tape and digital editing techniques. So that's what we expect. And of course, every performer intends to play all the notes. But ideally, every performer also intends to bring something musical to the performance, bring some adventure and bring some life. And in those days, they didn't care as much about a drop note or so, because in the culture it was different in terms of what are you doing in the big picture, and they didn't have the kind of editing technology that we have now. And so it was very different. So you have to train your ears to listen to Courtauld and hear beyond the wrong notes. And I can't remember if it was Shandor or somebody else in that same documentary who was saying even his wrong notes were fabulous.
Yeah.
And it's true. They're great.
Yeah.
I think that takes us to, I got a question. I think this is a good place to bring this in, because I think a lot of our listeners might be wondering, like, what are you talking about as far as the difference between how people played before and I think a lot of people, when they think of a pianist or they think of a musician, they think of a guy there with music, playing the music that's on the page, and that's what they're doing.
100%.
And so let's talk about like today's performances versus before. What were they focusing on, and why did you prefer them before?
Right. So in terms of, you're looking at a page, everybody's looking at the same page, so to speak, if they're all using the same edition, and that's another story. But they're all looking at the same page, but similarly, every actor is looking at the same script if they're doing Hamlet. And you're not going to expect every actor is going to intone or time to be or not to be in exactly the same way, with exactly the same emphasis. And it would be really boring if they did. But we somehow expect, when it comes to music, perhaps because we have a different relationship with it than we do with the spoken word. And we understand the nuancing of spoken language differently because it's what we do every day. But musically, how it is that you perform is subject to a whole lot of variety, even within the confines of the same notes, the same notation, the same directions on the printed page. So Shakespeare, just by writing those words, he's not suggesting specifically that you should pause between these two words for extra emphasis and maybe make this word louder and so on and so forth. Now, some composers would put certain directions in the score asking you to do that. So there's two things to this. They didn't necessarily put everything in the score that they wanted you to do, because some things were done at the time, in the same way that iambic pentameter, if you in Shakespeare, if you ever studied it in high school, which is as far as my Shakespeare goes, da 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 da, in terms of accenting, but you don't actually really talk like that robotically. It's a general sense of pulse and rhythm. So you would still be able to pause and to accent and do things. And we allow that in speech, but somehow in music, there isn't I think today, the training that there was and the sensibility that there was when people maybe had a direct connection either to the composer or to their lineage or the culture of the time when that was done. And a great example of this is Carl Friedberg, who was a Juilliard professor until 1945, when he was unceremoniously kicked out, who had trained with Clara Schumann, the widow of the composer Schumann, and also to whom Brahms had played through his complete piano music, one-on-one. And so, Juilliard in 1945, who the heck wants this old fuddy-duddy, right? Who Brahms played his own music to, which shows you a little bit of the shift of the sensibility of what was going on in the academic world and musical education. But there are recordings of him teaching the pianist Bruce Hungerford. And Bruce is asking him, he said, but over here, I was thinking I wanted to slow down a little bit, but he didn't put it in the score. And he's like, oh no, Brahms wouldn't put that in the score unless he really wanted you to slow down. But he slowed down when he played that for me. And he did that. And he says, you don't change the rhythm, but you can accent something, or you can pause a little bit. So it all depends how much. You don't change the note value, but you can stretch the phrase. And yet, the word stretch still has one syllable. It lasts longer. So you can do things in a certain way. And there are parameters. And there is the parameter of, what's good taste and what's not good taste. And those senses change. And this is where it starts getting complicated, because when we start looking at, do we have to do everything that was done at the composer's time? There's a lot of different directions we can go with this.
What does that really mean?
So what does this mean? But here's one piece. So if you listen to old radio broadcasts or TV programs and movies from the 30s to the 50s, you're going to notice that a lot of them are talking with a kind of voice like this, and they intone in a certain way, and they're all talking. And there was something that was stylistic at the time. That's the broadcaster voice, and that's the intonation, and this is the way they speak. And nowadays, if you listen to newscasters, one of the things I notice is that they do this dramatic pause before the last word, and they'll pause before a certain word in order to create a little bit of emphasis. And what's interesting also is that musically, that's what I would refer to as nouveau rubato, which rubato being that stretch of the musical phrase, where you hear pianists nowadays, they think that rubato, the way you stretch a phrase, is just by pausing before the last note of the phrase and then just drooping down and getting a little softer with it. But it deflates like a balloon. There's no actual musical tension or projection of the line that takes place that way. And it's completely formulaic, just like the 1930s speakers are, it's a formula, and the news announcers today, that's a formula. And music shouldn't really be formulaic, I think. But the challenge is that I'm speaking to here is how much do we go back to what was done at the time in terms of that was done at the time, but is the music limited to that?
Yeah. I had a quick thing that you brought up about the pause. When I hear Baroque ensembles from the last 10 years or so, it seems like the habit is to go, and I'm like, why? That doesn't make sense. But they argue that's what was done. And I often like Baroque recordings from maybe 50s or 60s, even though there are some things that aren't done, quote unquote, correctly. So that's one thing. And another thing you brought up was, the style of the time and trying to match that. Obviously, we have different ears. We have different sense of time nowadays. Anyway, the internet, things are just moving faster. And Mike and I have spoken about that too. That our ears and our culture is a little bit different. So that's hard to reconcile. And thirdly, you mentioned that Friedberg, he studied with, I think, Clara Schumann, who is, by the way, a composer too. So she would have had a direct line to that mentality, and phenomenal pianist. So it's not like she would have had technical difficulties, I don't think, and would have had to make musical sacrifices. So I think what she would have said would really hold some water. But then the question arises: are composers the best interpreters of their work? And sometimes I would say yes. Sometimes I would say most definitely no. So those are a couple of things. I wonder if you could talk to some of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge topic because, of course, it depends on their capabilities. And Friedberg, in one of those recordings, says, Brahms did a couple of things that for me, I didn't quite like. And that's absolutely fine. And, but we revere these people so much and put them on pedestals. So we think, well, how can we say that? Yeah. And I can guarantee you that some of the same musicologists and music teachers who say we should respect the composer's wishes and we should do justice to the composer, and these are, the composer's intention, these are all catchphrases in our current musical culture, that they would actually probably be quite horrified if they heard them playing. And these are the same teachers who will listen to some recordings by pianists who knew Brahms, like Ilona Ibenschutz and Carl Friedberg and so on, and say, and one of them did say this once on my Facebook page, oh, well, that sounds dated. To which I said, yeah, I know. So's the music she's playing. It's over 100 years old.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, when's the last time you went out and had a wild night of mazurkas and waltzes, right? I mean, we are living in a different time, right? And not to speak of intermezzi and ballades, and it's not the same musical time at all. So when it comes to composers playing, yeah, it's great to know what their intention is. And all of us have intentions, and in any great work of art, there's something that exists that's beyond your intention.
Yeah, it's a fine line, I think, between what is subjective feeling and taste, because you have to study that and refine it and develop that. But yet, who's developing that? That comes from your culture and from your teachers. And I mean, there's kind of an esoteric philosophical question there, which I don't know if we'll ever answer.
And I think also it's almost like we're all reading in Latin. In other words, in some ways it's a dead language from a standpoint. As we're trying to, you mentioned mazurka, like you're right. Who's doing mazurkas these days? And yeah, and I watched a video with you where you had, and I apologize, I don't remember the name of the pianist who played a mazurka that was unbelievable, and I'd never heard it that way before. It was and I'm like, well, maybe it's because I don't know what a mazurka is.
Yeah, Ignaz Friedman. Yeah,
so I was going to say he's the best.
And yet there's other amazing ways of playing it. So to give a little background to our listeners, because this was, again, something, and I couldn't fully develop it in that video because it was a short introduction.
And by the way, I will put I'll put a link to that video in the show notes if anyone wants to take a look at.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, so Ignaz Friedman grew up in Poland, and he danced the mazurka, which is a folk dance that Chopin then incorporated elements of that folk dance into his piano music based on that form. And Chopin himself, there's documentation that he got into quite a heated argument with the composer Meyerbeer when Meyerbeer walked into one of Chopin's lessons, and he was teaching someone how to play a mazurka, and he was asking him to pause and accent the rhythm in a certain way. And Meyerbeer said, well, that's 2/4 time. And Chopin said, no, it's 3/4 time. And so there's a limitation to the notation and what can be put on the page.
Right.
And if we don't walk in there, into a musical, period of study or into our relationship with a score, understanding that this black and white text is like a blueprint, but we live in homes that are beyond a blueprint and they're more dimensional. Then how are you going to bring that to life, right? We are more than skin and bone. We've got skin and we've got muscles and there's a blood flowing through and so on. And how do you go to the skeleton of the score and bring something to life? So there was a limitation, certainly in the 19th century, for how he could communicate the kind of accenting that he wanted. And Friedman, having danced the mazurka as a kid, was aware of that sense of rhythmic beat and propulsion. And so in 1930, he recorded a dozen of them, and they are exactly the kind of playing that would cause a lot of academics to run screaming from the room, because it's just so completely unconventional to our ears. They're not unconventional to Chopin's ears. And this is the issue, that I think when we have somehow I think there's an implicit bias that we somehow think that what we believe to be true is true, and that what we like is actually the standard. And rather than you hear something that you disagree with or is something you haven't encountered before, and you say, well, that's weird because it's not like what I've heard before. So what? Why do you think that what you heard before is the standard? Why do you think what you already believe is true? Like, it's great for an operating principle to get you to where you're going, but are you saying there's never any learning, that there's nothing else for you to expand your horizons with, that the composer might not have known something?
And standard isn't the same as good or right either.
Yeah.
So it's just what we're growing. And I think this leads to, we've talked many times, Mike and I, about the virtues of studying a certain piece or getting in depth, or music in general, or whatever you want to say. It could be our type of music, Western European, but just getting, I think it opens you up to, if you have good training and if you're willing to put in the time and search for these things. And of course, now it's at everybody's fingertips, but I don't know if that helps. I think the fact that we dug around for them made it that much more appreciable. And we appreciate, I loved finding these things. Yeah.
Yeah. But, the thing with that, again, going back to Friedman and then, looking back on how did composers' interpretations, because I didn't really fully answer that question. We know that Friedman is doing something in his Chopin mazurkas that it sounds like, based on that testimonial of a real world event from Chopin's life, that he was aiming for. And it doesn't mean that that's the only great way to play mazurkas. And mazurkas were not just danced in the countryside. They were also, done more elegantly and
formally. Yeah.
And Jan Smetterlin heard them, a great Polish pianist. He heard the mazurkas in both settings as well. And he doesn't accent in quite the same way, but his sense of timing as well is very different, and it's fascinating. And then you get Marila Jonas, who recorded a handful of mazurkas in the 1950s, late 40s and early 50s. And it's just some of the most incredible mazurka playing ever. And she's not doing it quite like that either, and it's wonderful. So it doesn't mean that this is the only way, and that's the important thing, I think, as well with composers, that you hear Rachmaninoff play his second concerto, and all of them, and they're fantastic. And that's a recording of Rachmaninoff at one time playing that, and it's great to hear, and it doesn't mean he would have played it that way another time. And he also liked the playing of other pianists who played those works differently. He liked the playing of Mazejevich and
Horowitz
and a host of others, and Gieseking, who played Rachmaninoff's third concerto at almost half the tempo, such that Rachmaninoff's wife walked out after the first movement. And Rachmaninoff went and had this great conversation with him after the concert, and he apparently had really enjoyed it, even though that wasn't his quote-unquote vision or intention. And we know, I think we imagine that, we're trying to do the right thing, and I think and it's a worthy aim. This doing justice to the composer and serving the composer's vision. But if we read about the composers as people and their relationships with interpreters and what happened, we can get some insight, like Beethoven hearing his Appassionata Sonata played for him for the first time by Marie Bigot, who taught both Mendelssohn's, and saying to her, well, that's not quite what I had in mind, but, yeah, go ahead. That's great. And he gave her the manuscript.
Yeah, I think working with composers today is enlightening, and
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a double-edged sword because there's such a proliferation of styles and differences in this
Mm-hmm.
generation and even the last. And I've worked with a few living composers, and I've had a couple dedications, and it's funny even playing one piece where a composer might say, oh, it's not my best. I mean, they're usually very self-effacing and pretty humble in my experience, and then when they hear you play, that they're usually pretty open about it too. I've rarely met composers. I mean, I never met Boulez. I've heard of, or Stockhausen. I've heard of their reputations, but I haven't worked with composers that are so rigid that
Mm-hmm.
like anything. No, that's not what I envision. Yes, I've worked with some that it's could you get this kind of? I'm aiming for this color, and okay, now I understand a little bit more. And maybe they couldn't quite notate it, but usually they're quite happy just to have their works performed and have the music get out there, because once you hear it, it might sound different than it does in your head, and it starts to coax things out of you as well, and it develops them as musicians. So I think most composers are pretty open to those things, and we kind of have this idea, this rigid mindset, or I think it's more projection than anything, that all the composers of the past only wanted it one way,
Totally.
and they always played it that way. Of course, Beethoven didn't play his sonatas the same way all the time in different
Absolutely.
settings.
And there's evidence of, I forget the name of who it was who was in London and asked Beethoven, he was going to perform some of his symphonies. Would he please send the metronome markings? And then the letter never arrived. So he wrote back to Beethoven and said, would you please send them, the letter arrive? And then the first letter arrived. And then the second letter arrived. And the metronome markings were different.
Yeah.
So what does that say? But there's a lot of stories about this, and Rachmaninoff is actually a good starting point to talk about, first of all, what we hear on record, but also that authenticity, quote unquote, in the score. Georges Bolet, great Cuban born pianist who then moved to the States, he was studying in New York and was at, I believe it was in Philadelphia, where they were first rehearsing prior to the first performance of Rachmaninoff in his Rhapsody on a theme of Paganini. Rachmaninoff, keep in mind, of course, when he's writing a piece for piano and orchestra, doesn't have an orchestra in his studio, right? So he's writing it as he wants to. And in this read-through, he's realizing that things sound different than he expected, and conferred with the conductor, and they changed some things in the score. That score which had already been published and printed and was never republished with those changes, which then made it into Bolet's score. And he would tell his students, decades later, well, so much for the Urtext being, the official, printed edition with that the composer, with all of the composer's indications and no one else's. So I think that's kind of insightful, that even prior to the first performance, let alone what might he think about it 5 years later, or 10 years later, or 20 years later.
Well, there's lots of evidence of composers revising stuff years later.
Yeah, and there's a recording of, which I put a very brief excerpt in that video, of Raoul Koselski playing Chopin's famous Nocturne Opus 9, number 2, with all kinds of extra runs and ornamentation and little things that on the record it says with authentic Chopin variants. It was recorded in 1938 when Koselski was a child. He studied with a pupil of Chopin's, Karol Mikuli, who had apparently heard Chopin play it that way and took notes down. Now, Chopin played it that way that day and might have played it differently again another time. Yeah. And if you were to do that now, you would probably be taken round, to a firing squad around the back of the building, because you can't do anything to the text, even if the composer himself might have done that. So it's quite instructive when we listen back, and if we really look at all the evidence, not just the evidence we want to look at, in terms of what composers' attitudes were towards their music and how, what they would have been deemed as authentic. I think, like you were saying, Elias, a lot of them are just happy that their music was being performed. And I am pretty convinced that most of them did not think we would be playing their music 100 or 200 or 300 years later.
Yeah, I think even with Chopin, we've discussed this before when there are different editions of it. He wanted to make money, so he might have sold one thing to a German publisher, another edition, or his student would have sold an edition with random notes from Chopin to an Italian or an English or a whatever French publisher often. And so we often get a couple of versions coming down to us. And one of them, I mentioned the third sonata, which I performed. There's a French Meissonier edition, which is 4 years or 3 years after the original quote unquote German edition. And it's got a couple measures that are totally different harmonies. And when I first heard a recording of that piece, I think there are two now extant recordings with that version in it. And I thought the pianist just had a memory slip and played something wrong, but then was really good at improvising and came back, on the track. And then I saw in the notes it was on a YouTube video, and somebody's mentioned, oh, this is the 1849 Meissonier. I was like, wow, what? I have to find that, and I've only found a manuscript version of it. But then I included that when I performed it.
Awesome.
Well, yeah, that was one thing. There was something else I thought while you were speaking of. Well, it'll come back to me, but go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much to this, right? Well, coming to Rachmaninoff again, and if we take a look at the recordings, and we expect that their recording is then a fixed document. Now, somebody like Carl Friedberg actually resisted making recordings, and I think he made his only recordings when he was 83 because he didn't appreciate the concept of one finished interpretation. That there's only one final version, and that's your recording of this, and that's the way it should be done, which is the complete antithesis of Glenn Gould's whole approach of, you spend all this time in the studio and working, and you create this one version, which is your testament to that piece of music, which I 100% appreciate. I think it's absolutely valid.
It's an artistic vision or
and then it's a statement, and you produce that, and then it can be repeated, enjoyed and over, and it's brilliant, so yeah, why not? And that is one of the reasons why Friedberg didn't record. Now, Rachmaninoff made a whole bunch of recordings, like 10 CDs worth, which in the days of 78s was a pretty hard process. But there were a lot of people who said that his playing in record was different than his playing in concert. And it's also documented that he refused to allow his concerts to be broadcast, which is why there actually isn't pretty much anything of him in concert performance. What just came out a few years ago on the amazing Marston Records label, there's two incredible things of Rachmaninoff. One of them is him in Eugene Ormandy's living room in December 1940, a couple of weeks before Ormandy was due to conduct the world premiere of Rachmaninoff's symphonic dances. And Rachmaninoff was giving a run-through at the piano of, his vision, how he wanted it to be played. And it seems he was being recorded without his knowledge because the sound is quite far and so on. But you hear him playing with way more passion. And, the schmaltzy phrasing, and he's singing along with it as well. And you hear his voice going up and down, and it's way more passionate than what you hear in his studio recordings. So he, like many artists, might have treated studio recordings as a temporary thing. This gives people a chance to hear the music. They get to hear the performance, not that he was only into commercial things, but that's one of the things that guarantees that people are going to like your music, hear your music, go to your concerts. But it wasn't a replacement for the live performance. And that's why he refused to allow himself to be recorded in broadcast.
Yeah, although I have to say with Rachmaninoff, I find that a lot of people with him, or even somebody like Michelangelo, and occasionally with oh my God, the Italian Polini, that they say, well, they're cold, or they're playing is austere, and I don't find Rachmaninoff's playing cold at all. Yes, it's very steeled sometimes and steely, and driven, but boy, there's a lot of passion in there. It's just restrained passion.
It's more, yeah, I know, and there's something to that, right? And Mazejevich would play, I think, a little less. He definitely patrician is one of the words that's often used, and but not with the same steely, steel fingers with velvet gloves kind of thing that we hear with Rachmaninoff. But it's still like pretty like off the wall, like off the charts kind of passion that we hear when he's playing in Normandy's living room. I mean, it is really a whole other level. And I had a preview of that. I did the promo video for Marston, and I literally woke up in the middle of the night 2 nights in a row to have to listen to it again because I was so completely flabbergasted by what I was hearing, that it's like you are like a fly on the wall in this private situation, hearing this great composer playing completely uninhibited. And it wasn't meant to be captured, but it was. And it does reveal a different sensibility and makes you wonder, okay, like we don't discount his commercial recordings, but recognize for any of these artists, because a lot of them said this, that what you hear on record is them on record and it's not them in concert. And we, I think in our current cultural time, we tend to think that a concert is just like a recording, but in person.
Right. And it is.
And it's just that they should play the same way, and it should be just as clean and just as sanitized. And and when you look at how recordings are made, where microphones are placed, I mean, I don't know what this whole situation is of sticking a microphone inside the piano where your head would never be, and underneath and all around, and as opposed to just a pair of mics placed appropriately the way your human ears would be placed, capturing and then reproducing. Like you listen to 1950s EMI recordings, those are, I think, perhaps the most incredible piano recordings in terms of sound quality ever.
And they were not experience,
and they were not sticking the microphone into the piano. So people have gotten this skewed perception of what the piano should sound like and what live performances should sound like. And then you go to a real concert and say, oh, well, the piano sound it's further away and I can't hear it in the same way. And it's not as good. And I'd rather listen to a recording, and I'd rather hear the right notes and not hear people crinkling little cough drop wrappers and stuff, which, of course, none of us would like. Although at this point, a year into COVID, a lot of us would just like to be at a concert anyway.
Right. Can you please get some of that?
But I think that we have to recognize that artistically as well, the record might still be a shadow of what some of these musicians did in concert. And we know from, Myra Hess's statements and some of her live recordings, Mazejevich as well, Lipatti also, you hear these artists in different circumstances, and sometimes you hear something really quite different. So I think that ties into also, there isn't necessarily just one way for any person to play a given piece of music or in general. And I think if we don't have this sense of aliveness and evolution and shifting our interpretations and the styles and the reality that performers are human and might play differently, and it all gets very complicated. And musical performance is not, I don't think it should be rigid. And this is the underlying issue to all that we're talking about. And I think you mentioned about asking the questions, there's a lot of questions here and we don't necessarily have the answer. And I don't think we can necessarily arrive at an answer. And our culture is not good at asking a question and letting the question be there without an answer.
Right.
Yeah.
And, but I think when it comes to artistic matters, we need to do that. And we need to let this stuff marinate. And that's what happens when you marinate. You leave things for a while to sit.
And it's okay if they're never answered. There are philosophical questions that will cycle through the ages, and different people will have different ideas. And that's okay if they're never quite answered, because the importance is the question itself. It reminds me of Hitchhiker's Guide. We know the answer is 42. We just don't know the question. So asking the question is very important and makes you think and contemplate these things and grow yourself. And I think we need a little dose of that these days. With, you mentioned before something that made me think, what's the definitive thing? And these days we're looking for my vision, or my idea is the definitive one. It's the standard. Yeah. Well, maybe in your small bubble in the culture it is, and maybe you're also misinformed, or you have just different data that you're going on, or you're not looking. There's so many aspects of life that could be enhanced and improved if we were a little bit more open, thoughtful, introspective, questioning, and understanding of others. I think that comes through music.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think
Well, and I
seeing it
think
through the eyes of all these composers and pianists is very helpful. Go
and I
ahead, Mark.
think as I was just going to say, and I think as well, and I'm curious about your take on this, Mark, as well. What would you say maybe to a young artist, a young pianist who wants to create their own artistic vision, but maybe feels a bit confided or a bit
Constrained or
locked,
something?
constrained, locked in to what they've been taught. How can we open people up to these ideas?
Well, I think the first thing is to listen, and to listen to a lot of different performers playing, and not, I used to have my preferred approach, right? And Lipatti was the musician who really appealed to me because he had a more objective stance, and it was very clear. And the way he plays, it's very architecturally clear, but it's also, there's still plenty of emotion, and technically it's absolutely masterful.
Yeah.
But I came to appreciate a lot of different performers, and I just recorded a program where I featured 12 different pianists playing the first movement of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, with timings ranging from 4 minutes and 1 second to 7 minutes and 25 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
And every one of those performances is fantastic. Mm-hmm. So the issue is when we come, oh, that's the one, that one's better, that one's better. Sure, it might be better in different ways, but what if there's no better? What if there's just all of these wonderful ways? And then if you listen at the very least to a variety of interpretations and start to figure out where your personal sensibilities lie, you can have all of your reasons can be perfectly valid as to why you like one more than another. And I recently guest lectured at a class at UBC here in Vancouver online, and played excerpts of 3 different versions just from that first movement. And the 3 people who spoke up each liked different ones for different reasons. Mm-hmm. Fantastic.
I wonder a couple things, if pedagogically that could run some risks of just, a 12-year-old that just doesn't have the experience and listen to these 30 recordings, they won't even be able to pick up some of the things.
No. It depends at what age we're talking about. So I wasn't definitely speaking about 12-year-olds. I was thinking more about people who are at the university level and an advanced level. So I think, though, that, it's like anything. You learn structure, and then you learn how to relax with the structure. Yeah. But you need the structure first. Yeah. Right. So
I think so too. Yeah.
So I think that you need to learn how to follow the rules, and you need to learn that what this is. You pay attention to the score first, actually, because that's all we have to go on first, and then we learn. Okay, so how do you feel about this? Mm-hmm. One of the issues, though, comes from when teachers are teaching a student to feel a certain way, but it maybe isn't how they feel, and this becomes challenging because then the teacher is actually teaching them to lie.
Yeah.
In their musical performance, because that's not actually how they feel.
I think asking questions is important in teaching that kind of Socratic method.
Yes, totally. Like, why did you do that? Not as apparently in a video of a famous teacher doing master classes on Beethoven sonatas, and he said, "Why did you do that?" He said, "Because I thought it sounded better." And this famous pianist teacher was absolutely apoplectic that somebody should do something that they liked. And it's like, really, maybe that's why I don't like your playing that much, because you're not actually bringing anything personal. And unfortunately, the two have become dichotomized now. So it's either the score, and for the composer and the performer has to become invisible, or it's the interpreter before everything, and they have license to obscure the composer's intention. I like to say it's more of a dance, that you have to be on the dance floor and you have to meet each other. And how is it collaborative? And how does the interpreter bring their perspective truthfully, not based on ego, based on, well, I can do what I want because I'm a performer. That's not it at all. But you still have to have something behind it. You have to have some intelligence and some training, and ideally some understanding of the culture and a little bit more background. Edwin Fischer was a great pianist he made the first ever recording of the Bach Well-Tempered Clavier in the 1930s, and was a great Beethoven interpreter. And he wrote in his book on Beethoven sonatas that he himself was an avid gardener. And he said, you can't just have sterile soil. You need bacteria. Like, you need to bring something alive. You need to create the conditions so that something can come to life.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have to show up to the score where you have this raw materials and you have to bring something into it to bring some life out of it. So ideally it's not injecting into it per se, but you're drawing something out of it, but you have to show up.
Yeah.
So, but if you just show up and you say, well, I feel like doing this and I'm just going to do, that's not it either.
That's not it. It's interesting you mentioned the Moonlight Sonata, the various interpretations. When I was doing pictures at an exhibition, and we've had a few podcasts on that, and I did that for my thesis, and looking at the different versions at the time, I listened to many of them, and some were extremely, Pogorelich was on the end of extremely slow. I think his version was 40, 43, 44 minutes overall. And Horowitz, who cut one of the middle promenades, his version was 26 minutes. So almost twice the time for this piece. How can you have such disparate views? And, taking somebody like Pogorelich, who I think is a genius in many respects, and I think is playing when he was, I would say, in his peak form right after he won, and even for many years is phenomenal. But then I've heard him do things where it's just so stretched and drawn out. And I think, are you doing that to be different just for the sake of being different? Or do you really have an artistic vision that matches? Because it does not, when you stretch it that much, it just does not seem to fit the music anymore.
And this is unfortunately, what's happened. I think in general with it, for people to stand out, that's kind of what they need to do. I've been saying that actually about Pogorelich since the 90s, that I thought he was taking the individual thing just a little bit beyond what it was I was comfortable with. And right now it's a lot beyond, because I think it's just these lugubrious tempos. That's just you doing what you want and it's not really serving the music. So
it could be something that's slow that I think the music lends itself to different interpretations. So for one of my classes, I played the two of the iconic versions of the Scarlatti Sonata, the B minor, the Michelangelo version, which is always put out there. It's on the documentary, The Art of Piano, and then the Gilels version. And the Gilels version is approximately half the speed, but it's beautiful, and it's a totally different take on. Maybe this is more vocal than pianistic or mechanical.
But you're also bringing up something important, because when we talk about speed, that's one characteristic, and if you don't listen to what the person is doing with speed, we're missing the point, because sure, he's doing so they're each playing at their speed. It's part of the equation, but what are they doing with their tone? What are they doing with dynamics? How are they pedaling? How are they phrasing? There's all of that stuff. And what happens when we talk about that rubato, right? When they're stretching a phrase, this is what most people listen to, and they'll listen to old recordings and say, oh, well, listen to how they're doing that. And I actually had a university class where a couple of the people piped in because they thought Rachmaninoff's rubato in the same Chopin Nocturne, Opus 9, number 2, was extreme. He who was born less than 25 years after Chopin died, and whose music these same pianists play, his rubato was extreme. To which I said, well, what if you heard a recording by Chopin and you didn't like it?
Yeah, exactly. What do you think about, because I know Wim Winters has been on this program, and he talks about the metronome markings a lot. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a bit. It's definitely a controversial stance. I think again,
and you don't have to answer it, or it doesn't have to be definitive. I'm just curious because Mike and I have discussed it too, and I.
Yeah. So again, getting back to what I was talking about tempo, because this will tie in. When it comes to rubato, it's not just how they're adjusting it, but it's like not just adjusting the time. What are they doing with the dynamics? Are they getting louder? Are they getting softer? What are they doing to tonal color? Is it fading? How's the color changing? How are they pedaling? All of that is part of it. So if you limit something, and this is something to consider with this fellow who says that all the metronome markings should be done at half speed from what we think. Well, what else are you bringing to the table? Are you playing it with beautiful tone? How are you phrasing? Tempo is not the only thing. Speed is not the only musical characteristic. So if that's all you're going on, then you're missing a lot.
The reason the 4-minute Moonlight Sonata and the 7-minute Moonlight Sonata isn't because of the tempo necessarily. It's because of how it was played.
That's exactly it. And so it's only because Solomon knew how to pedal in a way where he could create this haze and this hypnotic effect where you have this haze, but you don't lose any clarity. So he created this magnificent effect. So he could do it at 725 when other people playing at that tempo, I would be asleep within the first 10 seconds because it's not working. And there isn't the beauty of tone. There isn't the skilled use of balancing voicing. Do you accent notes similarly on repeats or not? There's all of these other things that happen. So when it comes down to what I would describe as legislative ethics musically, like this is what you have to do because this is the right thing. And if you don't do this, then it's wrong. As opposed to what's really appropriate. What's really the right thing? Like if it's the right thing, you don't need to tell people to do it.
Or what's the difference between good and right? Maybe it's good, it's not right, but it works. The other thing you mentioned is that Beethoven in the orchestral rehearsal, he sent 2 or 3 different metronome markings that I'm sure they were quite different and the conductor was confused. Maybe at the time of composing, I'm thinking of Hammerklavier, which does have the quite metronome marking. At that time, he had some vision. I mean, he was already mostly deaf by then. This is Opus 106. So he thought, okay, I want this to kind of move and be lively and this and that. And maybe he didn't think of the other tonal considerations that he would have had he played it himself or listened to it or whatever. And maybe years later, he would make that metronome marking slower. We don't know.
And maybe what stage was his deafness at? How, and just the simplest answer, right? Maybe his metronome was off. I mean, was everybody's stopwatch it wasn't like nuclear powered kind of like everybody's like watches. It's set to exactly the same time, right? So the whole, Mission Impossible, synchronize your watches situation. There's no guarantee that whatsoever, and it's the likeliest explanation is that his metronome was off. And how would he know? Because what are you comparing it to? Do you have a stopwatch where you're like sitting there and counting and making sure that your metronome is set properly? That's the easiest explanation.
Yeah.
And
also, I think there was somebody that discovered a tuning fork from Beethoven's era, or one of his tuning forks that he used later in life, and the pitch is quite higher. We think of the A 432 back then, or even 420 something in the Baroque era, but it's 440 something. Now maybe some of the metal could have.
Who knows?
Who knows?
Right.
Like again, the pianos from Beethoven's time weren't 200 years old when he was playing them. So, we listen to those pianos now. Well, they probably didn't sound like that because they weren't 200 years old. So, there's all kinds of things where we simply can't know, that I think that we have to have some degree of musical sense and what's musical. So really, in the sense of, tempo or whatever interpretation and timing you take, and that Chopin Nocturne Opus 9 number 2, Rachmaninoff plays it in 5 minutes, Hoffman plays it in 4, which is a 20 to 25% difference depending on whether you're measuring up or down with the speed difference. So it changes the nature, it changes the mood, and both of them are great, and both of those moods can be totally faithful to the heart of what Chopin was doing. And we know Chopin was trying to imitate coloratura sopranos because the concerts he invariably went to were concerts of singers. And so this is the bottom line. Like if you don't think contextually, then you're missing the point. Right. Is the phrase at a singable tempo?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If
the voice is the most.
Tempo, yeah. That's what it is. So how would it breathe? And how were any of these composers trying to create this voice? And with an orchestra, it might be a much bigger than human voice. And so here's this power. But how is it communicating something? And also, what's the emotion that's in there? Right? And so presto means fast, and there's going to be some lively and vivace and so on. So if you take that down to half of the speed, sorry, but it's not presto, it's not vivace. So for me, that theory goes out the window. So, and you're saying that no fast music was ever written, which I think is not true.
Well, unless you bring something else to the table where it's like, how about articulation and fast dynamic changes, and then it will sound fast. Then I could, buy it a little bit more.
Right.
For sure. But again, it's not a hard and fast ethical there is only one way. This is the one answer. This is the one rule. And this is where I say also that, these historical recordings are a starting point for this conversation, but what they give us that other written testimonials don't is an actual experience to hear the performance, the actual air that they were breathing, that they were in the room.
Yeah, because if you listen to not Lamond, what's the Frederick? You'll remember his name. Very old Chopin player, but one of the first that recorded etudes.
Robert Lorta.
And not him, because he's a little too obscure for me, but somebody pretty famous. And I think of him recording, let's say, in the 1930s, and he would have heard people play it that either knew Chopin or studied with Chopin.
So Francis Planté, I don't know if he's
Planté,
the one.
That's it, Francis Planté. And
so he recorded just a few etudes and some other works for about an hour. So he was 90 at the time. It was 1920.
Yeah, so he's already playing them maybe slower, but they're still quite fast and pretty agile for his age. So
yeah, he was also 90. So he's not going to play Opus 10 number 7 or Opus 10 number 8 at the same speed that he would have done 50 years earlier. So that is where if you don't take context into consideration, then you can't bring musical insight to the conversation, because you're missing the big picture. So I think that's part of it. But then you listen to him play Opus 25 number 1, and it's absolutely gorgeous. And even Opus 10 number 5, he's very agile for somebody who was 90. And 90, let's also keep in mind, in 1928, somebody who was 90 is more like 110 now.
Right.
70 was old back then. And you hear a lot of pianists who are 70 who sound, in worse shape than Planté did back then. And he exclaimed in rather a colorful French word at the end of his recording of one of those pieces, because he was not playing quite to his desired flexibility. So we can't take, again, all of those, everything that somebody did on record as their final version. We have to look at the context. We have to look at how old was this person, and when was this done, and what conditions, and so on.
What are they trying to say? I think, and Elias and I have talked a lot about this, as far as there's also the audience to consider from a standpoint of, the audience that listened to Rachmaninoff in the 30s is not the same audience that's going to hear Rachmaninoff in 2021. It's going to be completely different. They've heard and not just culturally, they've heard Rush along with, you know what I mean, but along with, but also just they're used to hearing it in a certain way. And I'm not saying they're used to hearing it in the correct way or the right way or anything, but what I'm saying is that they're used to hearing something that is in a certain way. And so when you listen to a Rachmaninoff, it's almost you can't turn off that. You can't turn off that bug. It's done. It's cooked into
you can't unknow it.
Yeah. Right. And I think that's a whole other aspect to this that we're discussing here is the audience, the consumers of this music, the Mark Ainleys of the world that are listening to this.
I mean, the fact is that we've, as individuals already from the beginning, we're going to have our own inclinations and our own preferences. And then there's, what do we learn and how do we listen to more? My tastes have changed. And I like certain performers more now than I did before, and other ones that I liked more before, maybe I don't like quite as much, and that's all fine and it's part of the process. So I think if we stay too static and too rigid, then we're also missing out. And so I think one of the interesting things, though, is to consider, why do we like things a certain way? And what if I did hear something that was different from what I liked? And if I had to argue, if you were forced to argue, what's one or two or three great things about this performance that actually might be different from your taste? If you can find it, you're starting to open up your ears and your minds to different ways of doing things.
That's the idea in debates. And I love this, like, name one thing you like about your opponent. That's very useful and very helpful, because it brings people close. You look at similarities instead of differences. I have kind of a big question, and it's a bit of a subjective one, and you can go not just either way, but both ways on it. And then one thing I'd be curious to get your take on. The overall picture is, we have a lot of recordings. We can't not have them anymore. And is it useful Is it useful to have many recordings and all of this access at our fingertips? Has it ruined live concerts? I would say after this pandemic, the need for live concerts and interaction is even more obvious. And I think people have seen what it is to have a dearth in culture and cultural experiences. And also nowadays things can be tampered with and things can be copied so precisely. I just watched a documentary on art, and the whole art world, which is sort of I'm talking about the very very high end stuff, which is sort of a racket and sometimes tax haven ish. But people can copy that now. Now we have photocopiers. What's the point of having an original painting? What's the point of hearing an artist play in concert, especially if you're going to hear candy wrappers and if they're going to miss notes? So is it useful to have the recordings, or is it more detrimental? What are the pros and cons? And then maybe your take on the Joyce Hatto scandal, just very briefly, because you probably have a bit more, or you have a lot of awareness of that. I know maybe we can end with that sort of discussion.
Yeah. So yeah, lots of. Oh my gosh, all of these topics. I mean, it's a great conversation because we could be talking about all of these.
We're definitely going to have a part two, I think. Mark.
Yeah, that would be awesome. So recordings versus concerts. I mean, they're not the same thing. It's not the same thing if you are in the same room in real time with the instrument, with the actual sound waves coming out of the instrument in the room, and it's something never to be repeated. I'm taking actually Yale University's course online, The Science of Well-Being. And one of the things that's fascinating is that what brings people more pleasure than the things that they spend money on is the experiences. And there's tons of data supporting this. Experiences are intrinsically more valuable. And one of the things that makes them more valuable is the fact that they disappear and that there's a finite end to it. So I think there is something too, if you think back in your life, like all of the, what are some of the meaningful things that have happened and so on, a lot of them are probably going to be experiences. Yeah. And if it was from a thing that you bought, it was the experience with the thing that you bought, like me buying, Joseph Hoffman's Casimir Hall recital and finally finding this and then sitting down in my parents' living room and listening to Waldstein and wondering if somebody had put something psychoactive in my drink because I couldn't understand what I was hearing. And I still remember where I was in the room and looking at the speakers and seeing his face and thinking, what is going on here? Because this is completely different from anything I'd imagined. So there's the experience of that stays. And I think the experience of the concerts, I have a number of them where I can still remember. And that was, that in the moment magic. And the issue with recordings is we can have that experience over and over again, but it's also neurologically, there's the reality. It's not the same when you listen to something a second or third or fourth time. It's not the same as the first time.
Often gets worse.
It often, but not always. Sometimes you can deepen your appreciation. And there are recordings that I've heard, dozens, if not hundreds of times. And my appreciation has, it's still there, or it has deepened. And so it's the problem again comes down to either or as opposed to both and.
Yeah, I think that's cultural too. When you talk about experience versus a thing, I mean, my generation maybe, and I'm a Generation X, not really millennial, but I think millennials spend more on experience than on things. And my generation, and certainly the boomers, spent more on things. And that was just I think a product of the time as well.
For sure.
So that
But the Joyce Hatto. So actually, before I get into Joyce Hatto, so I don't think it's either or. I think recordings have been consequential, and as much as it's kind of my thing, because we can listen to people like Friedberg and Ibenschitz and Hoffman and Rachmaninoff and Cortot and all these great musicians who we can't listen to live because they're dead.
Yeah.
It's obviously done a lot of good and still does a lot of good and can continue to do a lot of good if people use it
correctly.
Well.
Yeah.
But I do think, however, that recordings probably precipitated a shift in our perception of music and what music is, because it did turn it into a product, which, there's always been commercialism in music. We can't think it's just in 20th century. I mean, this was happening in Chopin's time and Liszt's time and, Paganini and all of and Paderewski had more endorsements than Lang Lang.
Yeah.
So it should be known that this is not just a new thing that pianists endorse products. So, but I think they did shift things to people being able to hear themselves objectively, which can help, but it also, I think, leads to this whole notion of, what is correctness and what is a permanent statement, and our relationship with things being permanent versus ephemeral. Mm-hmm. And we've lost some of that capacity, especially given our time of multitasking, where we're looking at too many things. How many of us actually sit and listen to a recording now and do nothing else? You're not scrolling on your phone. You're not reading a book. You're not nothing else. I think the forced focus, which of course, you can drift off asleep and start imagining, sort of thinking about school projects or whatever else you want to think about when you're in the concert hall. Just because you're there without access to external stimulus doesn't mean your mind is going to be focused. But the invitation and the setting is one that's designed to focus purely on experiencing the music in a never to be repeated moment. So I think that I think we need both. I've been enjoying shifting to, and practicing now because I've become well aware of this. Recently, I've been focusing on it, listening to a recording and doing nothing else. And it's harder these days because we've trained ourselves not to do that. I still remember certain experiences, like I said, hearing Hoffman, listening to recordings back in the 80s and 90s. I remember the specific experience of listening to a particular recording. Like, that's kind of amazing. And we can continue to have those experiences. So I prefer not to take the either or. I think we really need the and the recordings do have tremendous value. And I think, live concerts, we need to do it. And we also need to push ourselves past our boundaries. I went to a concert in Vancouver, which I wasn't going to go to. I went to the pianist's masterclass, and I was a pianist I'd never heard of before, Andrea Lucasini. Mm-hmm. And his masterclass was so phenomenal that he could precisely articulate exactly the step that student was capable of taking to take their playing to the next level. Not what they really needed to do, like big picture, that you could instantly hear the change in their playing. I was like, okay, I need to hear this guy in concert. Mm-hmm. So I went the next day. And, what turned me off initially was he was alternating these contemporary pieces with Scarlatti sonatas going back and forth. And I was like, it was fabulous. Mm-hmm. It was wonderful. And it was, I bought the CD, and I don't sit and listen to the CD so much, really. It was that concert experience was fantastic, and I wouldn't have gone if I hadn't, I pushed myself outside of what do I normally want to hear? What do I think I want to hear? Yeah. So I broke past my comfort zone, and it was a marvelous experience. And I wrote as much to the impresario because I think that this is unfortunately what happens. How many times we're going to go hear the same Beethoven sonata or Schumann and Kinderszenen and such, and they're great. But, Schumann wrote lots of other great stuff, and there's all kinds of other Beethoven sonatas that are very seldom played. Mm-hmm. So it's a challenging question, and I think we really need both, and we really need to support music and have musical experience that's, everything that we now love was once new, and there was a first time at one point. Yeah. So really, it's about how do you give yourself that experience of something new over and over again. It's, you don't go continuing to listen to the same music in the same people necessarily or the same situations, right? So you start opening up to more. The Joyce Hatto scandal, to highlight for folks who won't know, because definitely piano collectors know about this. There was a series of recordings that were released on a British label that a man said he was recording his wife at their home studio, and she was sick with cancer, but whenever she was well enough, they would record her. And these recordings were achieving quite a lot of critical acclaim. And I mean, tons of recordings. I mean, there were just masses, and they were just cranking them out. Mm-hmm. And I actually know a lot of people who were really close to the situation. Yeah, me too. including the fellow, Jed Disler, who put the CD into his computer, and iTunes recognized the recording as being of a different pianist.
But see, that happens with me all the time with even my CDs.
That's right. It still happens. But then he compared, and he's like, well, some of the speeds were a little bit different. So the guy was adjusting the speed of them, and he was doing some kind of tinkering and changing the acoustics. But essentially, he was ripping off other people's recordings. And I actually know, just an FYI, that was the recording of the Liszt Transcendental Etudes. I knew the pianist. He's now passed away, whose recording they'd ripped off. Laszlo Simon was living in Tokyo when I was living in Tokyo in the 90s. And I met him in 1995, and I have an autographed copy of the original CD that Joyce Hatto had, that her shyster husband had ripped off. So more and more investigations were done, and it was found that basically all of the recordings were forged. Now, Alan Walker, who I've heard you refer to for his Chopin biography and his Liszt biographies, he used to work at the BBC. And was responsible for producing pianist broadcasts in the 1950s. And he said that Joyce Hatto never passed any of the BBC auditions. He remembered her.
Wow.
So she wasn't good enough to broadcast on the BBC. So, she had a case of nerves. She might have been a fine pianist, but again, this is something that happens. People are human. They can't always, pull themselves together to be able to perform under certain conditions, which is why some people like, Glenn Gould preferred being in the studio and he felt more free there. Other artists feel better in the concert platform than, in a studio without people and a red light going on. So it's going to be different. But what the Joyce Hatto scandal was fascinating because some of it was, there was a marketing story that was really appealing, that somebody was, she was sick and she was playing at home and that seemed to color people's perceptions.
Well, they wanted to believe it.
Yeah. And I mean, the playing was great, but it wasn't her. But the unfortunate thing that happened, and this also shows, and people will use this to denounce critics. And, there's again, the truth is more middle ground, that some of the critics who had given bad reviews to some of the recordings that Hatto had ripped off had given positive reviews to when she played it, but it was the same recording.
Yeah, just altered.
So, yeah. But again, 2 points. It was altered, so it wasn't the same recording in a way. And when you're listening to things in a different circumstance, you can hear things differently. So you might hear the same recording on different occasions. I now have an appreciation for recordings that I once didn't. Like I named about, first time I heard Cortot playing Chopin Opus 10 No. 1. I was like, come on, what's with all the clinkers, right? And then now I love it, and I wouldn't give it up.
Yeah.
So it was interesting because it showed, it revealed a number of things. But I think that it is true that we're, what we see, what we hear, what we're told can impact how it is that we hear. And in fact, Dinu Lipatti, the pianist who, I devoted so much time to, the predominant story that was told in, record and CD booklet notes was how sick he was. And at his last recital, he couldn't play the last Chopin waltz. And, it's just like this Hollywood drama. And he went and he played this, Bach chorale. And then he died 3 months later, and that colors how it is that you hear his recordings. Mm-hmm. And then you hear his one Ravel performance.
Yeah. Alvarado.
Alvarado the Gracioso, where he just tears the piano, like how there wasn't blood on the keyboard there, is, with this glissandi, what he's playing, he just rips it to shreds. And I was like, well, hold on a sec here, folks, because he wasn't always sick, obviously, when you listen to this. But I'd heard people say, Lipatti was a bit of a lightweight, because they had this perception based on what they heard. His last recordings were made in a small studio possibly on a shorter piano. And was his less tiring program, quote unquote, as he called it, because those were the works that he played to sort of be able to play when he was sick. So based on that, they form a perception of who this person is. Yeah. And so, we base our perceptions based on an artist's recorded repertoire, like Edwin Fischer recorded Bach and Beethoven. Well, he's a Bach and Beethoven and a Mozart pianist, so he wouldn't be playing Chopin and Mettner. Sorry, folks. But Mettner said that the best performance he ever heard of his second sonata was Edwin Fischer in Paris in the 1920s. Into the 1950s, Edwin Fischer was playing Chopin sonatas in his programs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think of Claudio Arrau as when he was older playing some of the late Beethoven sonatas, maybe slowly and lugubriously, but just beautifully. But then you hear versions from the 1920s of his Islamé, and it's like, holy crap! Like what a technique he had.
Yeah,
he wasn't this old man.
No, exactly. And, he went through this whole change as well. You start to hear the shift more in the late 40s into the early 50s. But you listen to stuff in the 1920s, it's very, very different. Mm. And even more so, there's a film about Liszt that was made in South America in which he literally acts.
Yeah.
As well as playing at the piano.
I love it.
It showed up online literally a year or two ago. And his playing there is like the best Arrau that I've ever heard. It is so passionate and volcanic, and it's just like unlike anything of him in record. Even those early recordings sound flat compared to what he was doing here. So this is the challenge, that we form these perceptions of who these artists are based on sometimes a single performance or a few performances, or maybe just their studio recordings, but we haven't heard them in concert, and we're limiting. And it becomes the same thing for any piece of music, that I've heard 3 people play this, and this is the way I like it, but you haven't heard X, Y, or Z play it, and you might be missing out.
Yeah.
So
it's like actors get pegged for certain roles, and then it's hard to see them in another role.
Right.
All the time.
Cifra was known for his Liszt and only playing Liszt, but his Scarlatti and Bach are some of the best I've ever heard.
I was just going to say, and that's actually if I ever show Cifra at the university, what I do is I start with a video of a Scarlatti sonata to show the sensitivity, and then I play the video of the Liszt Sixth Rhapsody, where you see his hands are moving faster than is humanly possible, and yet you're watching it happen. It's like, how is this happening, right? So that you get some context, so you don't just think he's this circus freak, as people tended to think, and you listen to him in lyrical passages. I mean, he's phenomenal. Yeah. Phenomenally sensitive artist. So he has absolutely been miscast. And I know from relatives and people who knew pianists how, Stefan Askenazy was really annoyed at being typecast as a Chopin pianist. And you listen to him play Beethoven in concert, is marvelous. Malkazinski's daughter told me about how her father, because he was Polish and was famous for Chopin, how he hated being typecast for that, and how when he dared, quote unquote, to play Bach in recital, I remember when he was learning this piece, he remembered he was, trying to go against this stereotype. So
some people, I think, use that as a selling point now. You hear a lot of, first of all, it's the foreign pianists it's always looked towards. So if somebody's coming to town, oh, they're from Italy, they must be great. It's like there are plenty of American, we're in Arizona, plenty of American pianists that are great. Oh, he's Russian, he must play Russian music well. Well, maybe not.
This stuff drives me crazy. And in fact, there's no doubt, like we were talking about, for example, earlier, Ignaz Friedman and Jan Smederlin, right? Having experienced the mazurka and also knowing the inflection of the language, there's definitely some insight they can bring. But if you're only relying on your genetics, if that's it, sorry, that actually doesn't do it. And there's plenty of Polish pianists who, are maybe famous for their Chopin. I think it's completely dull. And many Russian pianists who, maybe they're famous for their Rachmaninoff. They're not necessarily bringing the same thing to the table that somebody else could. And again, we can get into all kinds of discussions about what happened, with the iron curtain of sound that some of the post-war sort of Russians bring to their, which is completely different than actually the style of playing from Rachmaninoff, from that period, and Mazejevich. So it does become a selling point. And in fact, in the 1940s and 50s, in London, all of the foreign pianists, it was only their last name that was used. So if you look at records and concert programs, you see Mazejevich, Malkazinski, Pushnov. It was just their last names that was used. So it's like, ooh, this is a foreign artist. And even though all of them were like living, several of them were living in London. But that was the big selling point. Yeah. But there's much more to it. And for sure, the culture can be part of it. But in terms of typecasting, just to mention something also that people are now able to access so easily thanks to the internet. Bartok, even in his lifetime, was being so misunderstood that he himself was telling a pupil of his who was playing one of his sonatas, "Could you please play it a little less Bartok-ish?"
Yeah. Because the percussiveness, he was very vocal also.
Please stop banging, and Prokofiev doesn't bang his music, and Stravinsky didn't bang his music. They were playing it like jazz. But you listen to Bartok play Chopin. Yeah. There's a recording of him, a radio recording, and it's unfortunately the last part's missing. But it's Chopin's Nocturne, Opus 27, number 1, and it is one of the greatest recordings of anyone doing anything. Mm-hmm. And the thought of Bartok playing Chopin is mostly enough like something that would make most people's brains explode, because it doesn't make sense. It doesn't compute. It is the most incredible thing. And when I've played that at university classes, the teacher as well, I mean, the magic in the room that filled the room, and it was just everybody's jaw simultaneously dropping at what they were hearing. It is so completely outside of our expectation. And I think we really might consider, again, if we could hear Chopin play, if we could hear Beethoven play, there might be stuff that's just so completely different from what we expect.
Yeah.
And, drum roll please, we might not have liked all of it. But I think we might be willing also to then revisit. And I think that's the main thing that I think people should do in listening to any of these recordings, at least revisit why your preferences are your preferences. I'm not saying you have to change them, but consider why you like a certain style of playing, why you like a certain approach, and what if this, what if that?
Well, and by listening to those, it forces you to ask those questions. Like once you're confronted with something that you don't like, you have to then ask, well, why?
Mm-hmm.
What
and
is
it's
it
hard.
about it?
It's hard to do.
Yeah.
I know a lot of professors who are, and I'm glad we haven't had to mention names of anybody yet, whether we like or don't like, and it's great.
Yeah.
But, there are a lot of people out there who are comfortable and been teaching for a long time, and, they have a certain idea of what something should be played like. And, that's it. And if you played this Bartok recording for them, maybe they wouldn't change their mind. Well, okay. So, I've developed what I've had for 50, 60 years, and that's how it is.
Yeah, but and it's unfortunate because there's a reality that of course everybody's justified to have their tastes, and when you've done something for a long period, absolutely why not?
Sure.
You can have, but also if you're not exposed to anything, it's like imagine not opening your windows for 50 years and getting some fresh air in the room.
Yeah.
So how do what are you breathing in? It becomes increasingly toxic unless there's less freshness and circulation. And why are we doing this to begin with? And what were the composers wanting to begin with? If we're going to look at really prime intent. Is they were just wanting, I want my music to be played exactly the way I want? Or was it like, I want people to have an experience and I'm communicating an experience and there's emotion in there, and the emotion
Fluid,
with that rigid, that prescribed sort of must, should kind of, dogmatism. I think those are largely incongruent. Which is why, again, I've grown more flexible. I'm not with the attitude that we must play like Rachmaninoff wanted, or we must play like Ilona Ibenschitz or Carl Friedberg or any of the people who knew Brahms. You must play Brahms that way. No, but gosh, if you're going to say that you want to do justice to the composer or their vision, at least listen to the pianist who he coached.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Otherwise you're just lying.
Yeah.
You're not being truthful to what it is that you say.
Yeah.
And revisit why you believe that your attitude is correct.
Yeah.
And your perspective is correct. And it might be perfectly valid because, again, taste, right? There's a lot of taste. And so, some people are going to like the pad thai at this restaurant. Some people are going to like the pad thai at that restaurant, right? Yeah. And it's going to be different. And you go to Thailand and you're going to taste a lot of different kinds, depending on where you go and who the chef is. And when you were a kid, you went to your friend's home and his mom made hot chocolate and her hot chocolate tasted different than your mom's hot chocolate, even though it's all the same ingredients. And same with chocolate chip cookies. It's all the same ingredients, but it would be really boring if there was only one tasting hot chocolate for the entire planet to be enjoying, or one kind of chocolate chip cookie, and nobody's allowed to have any different kind, any different balance of sugar or flour, or gluten-free or not, or whatever.
And
so,
and can I also add, if there, as an evangelist for the arts and for music, and I know you are too, you never know which performance is going to touch that one person that's going to change their attitude towards great music. And I always am I'm hesitant to be too critical because I know that's somebody's favorite recording. You know what I mean? And that's the thing that got them to love. And I think it's important that we understand that particular, like we talked again about the Moonlight Sonatas, those different versions of these Moonlight Sonatas. Who knows who's going to touch that one person that's going to make them love that music again, or 100%. For the first time.
Yeah. I mean, and that's really what it's about, is appreciating, technically we're appreciating that piece of music. We're appreciating Beethoven, appreciating the piano, appreciating all of music. Like there's a whole lot of different levels and worlds that open up. And whatever that performance is or recording is, if it speaks to that person, that's really what counts. Mm-hmm. And so this is where I don't want to also prescribe, if somebody liked a recording that I don't like, and I think even if there's unmusical things in there or things that I wouldn't, I don't want to use the word approve of, but you know what I mean?
Right.
I wouldn't recommend that recording. they love the recording, they love the music, they're enjoying the music. Fantastic. Great.
Yep.
You know, and maybe also consider this as opposed to just, well, that's the only one I'm going to listen to.
Right.
That's just not the thing. In the same way that I'm not dissing what they're listening to, I would say, well, you know, just open
Try
up
some
to
others.
There's there's some other options. You know, we're talking to Mark Ainley, and I am thrilled. This has been such a joy, and we definitely need to do a part 2. If you're up for it, Mark, we'll have
Absolutely.
to do it, because this has been so fun, and I think we're touching the surface. There's a lot we can discuss with this.
It's just all deep stuff, yeah.
Oh, it's big stuff, and we didn't even get into any of the recording, so we're gonna have to do that next time too. But Mark, for people who want to support you, who people want to follow you, what's the best way that they can do that?
So my website is thepianophiles.com. On the top right corner, there's going to be all of the links to different social media. So Facebook is the most active interactive site, where there's 10,000 subscribers, but of course, due to algorithms, it's a couple hundred regularly participating. But there's lots of conversation, and I share a post there daily. On my Patreon page, if you want to support me by becoming a subscriber, there's previews to certain articles and YouTube uploads and audio recordings that I'm programming as well that I'm recording. So you can become a subscriber there as well and get some previews to some of my content. Over on Instagram is kind of fun, because they post a little historical photograph of the artist of the day who's been posted on the other sites as well. So any of those websites would be great.
Please do that. Please check those things out. Support Mark and the great work that he's doing. Elias, thanks for putting this together. I can't, I'm grateful for you and your support of the show. This has been wonderful and helping get Mark on the show with us.
I've been looking forward to this for a while, so it's great.
Awesome.
Fabulous.
Thank you. And it's wild, because I think this is actually the first time we've talked in real voice, speaking like old school, even though through new school technology, and we've known each other through Facebook for quite a few years, and we know we have a lot of mutual friends on there as well. So it's I'm glad this can happen.
All right, good times. Well, this is Mike Levitt, and you're listening to And If Love Remains.